Thank you, Rupert. So, as he explained, he and Marc have asked me to create with us some resonance. So I've been working with this for over 40 years now because I realized we've gone silent, and we always used to chant to remain living, to create a relationship with the boss so that our lives were taken care of. But since we stopped believing in the boss and started counting and measuring in order to know what would happen tomorrow and whether we'd be alive, sound was hijacked by the professionals as an entertainment, and we have been marginalized. So my work has been about reincorporating us into the sonorous world and creating a sonorous community. And one of the things that happened when we began counting with such fanaticisms is that we, with the popularity of keyboard instruments, we had to retune our music in the West, which, like everything else, we exported all over the world. And so Western music has been out of tune since Bach. And so in my endeavors to re-enchant us, re-enchant the world, I had to find a way of introducing sound which was in tune. And so chanting on a single note and amplifying the harmonics through resonance was the way that I have developed. And the harmonics can only be in tune. And harmonics seems to be the theme of the day. So I thought we'd start off by tuning together. So let's just close our eyes for a moment. And just become aware we're a wind instrument. So let's just become aware of our breath for a moment. Allow it to rise and fall as we are aware of it, rising and falling. And as we are aware of our breath rising and falling, just breathe through our ears to become one with the sound environment, so that when we begin to make sound, it's contained within the vessel of our own hearing, so that we create a circuit of attention, because we can only chant in the present. And if we listen to ourselves chanting while we're chanting, then we can also only be in the present. So I'm just going to invite us to become aware of our breathing, and then gradually allow our breath to engage our voices very quietly, and then very gradually becoming louder. And listening to the sound as it emerges, and when you remember that you've forgotten to listen, come back to the listening again, so that our hearing evokes our sound. the relationship between heaven and earth has always been mediated by sonorous beings. Angels don't come in herds or flocks, they come in choirs. And so I thought we would do a very short invocation of the transmission of enlightened beings in this smaller and in the larger session. So if we just close our eyes for a moment and see in our hearts a white light, a very bright white light. And we're going to chant a mantra. This is a Tibetan mantra of primordial space, the sound R. So we're going to do 3 R's. And the first R we're going to see as coming as rays of white light from the bright white light in our hearts. Along the dazzling rays of white light in all directions, out into space, out into the cosmos, and into the mantric letter R in the hearts of all enlightened beings, out into space, out into the cosmos, into the furthest reaches of our awareness, so that we're surrounded and connected to by these rays of white light, all enlightened beings everywhere. Then we'll breathe silently together, and then with the second R, extended single breath R, we'll receive the transmission of enlightenment from all the luminous white R's in the heart of all enlightened beings, back along these rays of white light, back into our own hearts, into the white luminous R in our own hearts. Then we breathe silently together, and then with the third R we remain present in the presence of the transmission of enlightenment from all enlightened beings. The second R we receive. And with the third R, we remain in the presence of that transmission.
Well, we heard a lot this morning about the collective amnesia we've got about food production and consumption and agriculture. And I work at the University of Wales Trinity St David, just down the road at Lampeter. And my agenda there in the university is to try and resolve the collective amnesia about the sky. To some extent, this can seem like a bit of a losing battle because light pollution advances even in the cause of energy efficiency, and we all forget what the sky looks like and how we connect with its importance in our lives. I had a few sort of seminal experiences of the sky when I was younger. One was New Year's night, 1979, lying flat on my back on a field in Devon, watching the stars, a bright starry night. It was the first time I discovered that the stars rotate around a central point in the sky, the North Celestial Pole. I'd always thought they rose over the horizon and set over that horizon. Of course, they don't. They revolve around the North Celestial Pole, which in Chinese cosmology represents the great Lord D, the celestial emperor. Another experience I had was lying on an island in the Nile, by the Nile, just before dawn one morning, the thick Milky Way spreading overhead, and the Muezzin somewhere miles away beginning the call for morning prayer. So as the Muezzin called, the Milky Way was glittering overhead, like a kind of Jacob's ladder, and I had there the realization of what it means in the ancient texts to have an ascent to the sky. So the sky's out. We've got a great sky today. We had a great sky this morning, a lot of drizzle. Sometimes we think that the sky has to be bright and sunny, or we need a nice full moon, but of course the sky is as it is. And this morning the drizzle from the sky was watering the fields of West Wales. So every bit as important as a bright rising sun or a brilliant starry sky, which tends to be what the poets write about. So I've got a short PowerPoint here where I just want to introduce ideas about the sky in various forms and then hand over to Marc and Rupert. So, of course, what do we all have in common above us? The sky. And what do we have beneath us? The earth. Now, the sky has no beginning. There's no point at which we jump up or go up in a plane or a spaceship and enter the sky. So if the sky has no beginning, it means that actually it begins at the soles of our feet. It begins where the air begins, and we are living in the sky. So we are already creatures of the sky. We spend our lives on earth, but in the sky. And we can gaze at the sky from the earth, and now, of course, people can also look at the earth from the sky. So one of my favorite quotes, so this is the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, from one who gave voice to this idea that if you look at the sky, and he's talking about the stars, it can be good for your soul. So he says, survey the circling stars as though yourself were in mid-course with them. It's actually traveling with them, having ascended to them. Often picture the changing and rechanging dance of the elements. Visions of this kind purge away the dross of our earthbound life. So the sky is therapeutic. Okay, we talk about a good view. There's a lovely view, a mountain, some trees, a lovely valley, some great buildings. But the sky is part of the skyscape, a mirror of the landscape. And of course, harmony, as was mentioned this morning, comes from the idea, an idea deep within the Western imagination, that the universe consists of musical tones. And if your eye is tuned well enough, you can hear those tones. And so one of the great geniuses of Western thought, Johann Kepler, actually, one of the towering geniuses, he's called the scientific revolution, was motivated by this whole idea to analyze the universe in terms of musical harmonies. In the process, he discovered laws of planetary motion. But I think he's probably the last great genius in Western thought to have really worked with this idea. And since then, it's sort of been unfairly marginalized. Now, from across literature, people talk about our connection with the sky. This is a great one. This is Leo Tolstoy, who put into the words of his great hero, Pierre, in War and Peace. We must live, we must love, we must believe that we have life not only today on this scrap of earth, but that we have lived and shall live forever there in the whole, Pierre was saying, and he pointed to the sky. Words, of course, Tolstoy wrote every word deliberately. He wrote those words deliberately. Pierre's saying, that's me up there. From modern literature, there's Tom Waits. When we're lost, what do? We look up to the night sky. But not only that, Gavin Praetor-Pinney, founder of the Cloud Appreciation Society, pointed out, we don't live beneath the sky, we live within it. Our Earth, our planet, is actually in the sky. We are as much in the sky as is the moon or the sun or any distant star. We are contained absolutely within it. Now, seeing the Earth from space then, seeing the Earth as in the sky has had profound consequences. So this is Stuart Brand, somebody many of you will have heard of, back in 1968, when the first shots were taken of the whole Earth by Apollo spacecraft. Brand heard about these, and of course then it was much more complicated to release photographs. You couldn't just put them on social media. Looking back then, there was no such thing. So these photographs weren't released. Brand wanted them released. He sensed they were important, so he started a conspiracy theory, realizing this was the best way to get things moving in America. He said, why are we not allowed to see the photographs of the whole Earth from space? And of course, in order to squash this conspiracy, NASA released the photographs. They were used on the front of the Whole Earth catalogue, and it's just almost taken for granted amongst all now historians of environmental thought that this was a seminal moment in catalyzing the modern environmental movement, because from space there are no political boundaries, there are no rich, there are no poor, there's just our one planet. The consequences of this is a much overlooked organization called the Overview Institute, mainly consisting of NASA astronauts, engineers, and so on. So people are actually hard-headed, right? You know, you'd not go into space unless you have an extremely clear head. And I recommend that you look up the Overview Institute. Its whole raison d'etre is to galvanize the move to save the planet, to galvanize steps towards sustainability by pointing out that, as you see it as an astronaut, the Earth has no political boundaries and no rich and no poor. And the overview effect is the name given to the transcendental effect that astronauts have and report when they look down at the Earth from space. And Carl Sagan, just to illustrate the fact that scientists are on the side of this. Carl Sagan, Who Speaks for Earth? This is a YouTube video. We are children, he says, equally of the earth and sky. So sometimes environmental campaigns are pictured as being anti the mainstream. The word harmony can be described as fringe. Actually, from across the intellectual world, across from the arts and humanities to the sciences, this makes sense. And of course, lunar effects on the Earth are contested. Scientific research can point in different directions, but as we know, sea turtles have a whole mating and fertility cycle connected to the moon, or as this scientific paper says, the moon position variables, which is a political issue, as I found in this paper, where the lunar tide cycle viewed by crustacean mollusk gatherers in the state of Paraíba, Brazil. So the point here is that the mollusk gatherers in coastal Brazil have knowledge about the relationship between the shellfish they're gathering and the moon, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, which government policymakers, industrial fishers, and so on ignore at their peril. So this is highly political. I'm just going to end by showing you. There's pointing to this video here. What a wonderful thing YouTube is. Look up videos from International Space Station, and you will see videos taken from the International Space Station as it moves over the Earth, and how beautiful it is. There with the northern lights, see glistening thunderstorms, lightning flashes, meteorites ending the Earth, causing the atmosphere to light up.
Science and spirituality at first seem completely separate categories. Within the mechanistic worldview that's predominated since the 17th century, the entire universe is the realm of science, and it's made up of inanimate matter moving in machine-like ways. Whereas spirituality is seen as something entirely subjective going on inside human heads. That's the standard view that we've grown up with, a kind of Cartesian split where the mind is just confined to us. We're the only things within nature that have minds or consciousness. The rest of nature is unconscious. But the traditional view of the cosmos in all religious traditions is that the cosmos is not an unconscious machine. The cosmos is more like a living organism. And this is something that science is bringing back. The Big Bang theory is rather like ancient cosmogonies of the origin of the universe through the hatching of a cosmic egg. And it gives us a picture of a universe that's been hatched and then growing and developing and evolving for nearly 14 billion years. And the real difference between religious and non-religious points of view is that for the non-religious, or at least the non-spiritual, the universe is unconscious. Minds are just inside brains. It's a cerebrocentric view of consciousness. We've all grown up with that. It's the standard default position in our academic and intellectual world. But all traditional views see that the universe is fundamentally conscious, as consciousness underlies the whole universe and permeates it. One way of putting this view theologically is panentheism. God is everywhere and everything's in God. God is in nature and nature is in God. That's the view I myself think is the most reasonable and makes best sense of the world we live in. From that point of view, spiritual practices are not just about things going on inside our brains. They're about ways of connecting with this much wider universe. For example, gratitude is a spiritual practice that all religions encourage, and indeed many secular practices encourage it. And there's now been a lot of research in the realm of positive psychology that shows that being grateful makes you happier. There's a very strong correlation between people who are grateful and people who are happy. But then the skeptics said, oh, well, of course these people are grateful because they're happy. Well, it turns out that when you do experiments take baseline people who are not particularly happy nor particularly grateful and encourage them some groups do gratefulness practices, others just make lists of complaints or write neutral stories. The people who practice gratitude are much happier than those that don't. And this is now an empirically established fact. It's good for you. In fact, most spiritual practices that have been investigated scientifically turn out to be very good for you. Now, meditation is another one. In the Buddhist and Hindu traditions, and the Christian and the Jewish and the Sufi traditions, meditation is about connecting our minds with the underlying mind of God, or the mind permeating the cosmos. Within modern secular world, meditation is about doing something that helps your brain work in such a way that you get neurotransmitters released that reduce stress and so forth. Anyway, the science shows meditation is good for you. Whatever you believe it's doing, it's actually doing you good. But for those who see the cosmos as permeated by consciousness, it's a way of connecting with the greater consciousness. Now, what I want to do now is think about how spiritual practices relate to food and farming, because Patrick wanted this conference to focus on food and farming, and there are spiritual practices already existing that relate to that. One is the traditional Anglican service of Rogation Sunday. Once a year in parish churches throughout the land, there are prayers. There's a blessing of the plough, and there's prayers for the fields. And this still goes on. Just a few months ago, I was in Compton Dundon in Somerset, in May, in fact. Joel was giving a workshop there, and I'd gone to stay for the weekend. So I went to the parish church of Compton Dundon, which has an ancient yew tree outside it, 1,700 years old, about 1,000 years older than the church itself. And then it was Rogation Sunday. We went out of the church. We processed around the church. And in each of the four directions, the priest led a prayer for the fields and the footpaths through the countryside and the woods and the whole countryside we were in. So this is still happening, a way of relating the spiritual life and the spiritual center. But a lot more could be made of this. The tradition is there. It's a valid and long-established tradition. Another tradition that we still have is Harvest Festival, Harvest Thanksgiving, giving thanks for the harvest and the way our lives depend on the land. Now, in many parish churches, like our own parish church in London, in Hampstead, this is slightly degenerated into being a collection of cornflakes packets and tins of baked beans, which are then given to food banks. And I'm sure food banks are, grateful for the cornflakes and the baked beans, but it does somehow lose the connection with the land. And people think, well, we're in a city, we get food from supermarkets. I myself think a lot more could be made of this festival, particularly bringing food in that people have grown in their gardens or allotments, because many people have gardens and allotments in cities, and relating it much more to our life. But the point I really wanted to end this bit with was focusing on the Lord's Prayer. Now, prayer is also good for you as a spiritual practice. It's been investigated, and people who pray are happier, have less depression, and so on, than those that don't. One study in the US took over 1,000 people aged 65 and found a matching group of 1,000 people, similar economic group, background, professional and occupational status. One lot were people who prayed regularly, the others were not. The people who prayed regularly 5 years later had survived 60% better than those that haven't, and they had had fewer medical complications, and they were less depressed. Now, there's many studies of this kind that shows prayer is good for the person doing the praying. Now, of course, people who pray think it's not just about them, but about the wider world and our relationship to it. And I think that what I wanted to bring up now, because it's something I'd love to pursue with Marc, is the Lord's Prayer, which is the most familiar of all the Christian prayers. Our Father, who art in heaven. Now, many people may think that's about heaven is some kind of mythic state in which God exists. But actually, when people said this, when Jesus said it, I'm quite sure he meant the sky. The heavens are the sky. And as Nicolas reminded us, the sky is the arena within which all our life takes place, is we're in the sky. That God is in the sky. And if God's everywhere, the vast majority of God is in the sky, because there's 99.999% more sky than there is earth. So when people say, oh, God's not out there, contemptuously of people who naively believe God's out there and is up there, I think that's a false dismissal. You see, I think God is out there and up there. And I think when people pray and look up to the sky, they're looking up to the place where most of God is. Of course, God's probably equally present everywhere, but nevertheless, the fact is the sky is where God is on all traditional views. And since the 20th century, with the expansion of our view of the universe through the Hubble Space Telescope, etc., the discovery of galaxies beyond our own, the sky is much vaster and much older than anyone imagined in the past. So the arena of God's abode and activity within the universe has vastly increased. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Or in the form of the prayer we use in choral evensong in the Anglican Church, in earth as it is in heaven. Now, what on earth does that mean? How does the will of God get done in earth or on earth as it is in heaven? How is the will of God expressed in heaven? Well, views have changed with science. This is influenced by science. At the time of Jesus, people thought that the heavens moved in a series of spheres, and that they were pretty well fixed in their movements, that the heavens were not a realm of change. We now have an evolutionary view of the heavens, and as Nicolas Campion reminded us, Kepler showed that the planets didn't just move in spheres, they moved in ellipses. And in his book about the heavens, which was one of the foundations of modern science, his book which was called Harmonices Mundi, the harmony of the world, he points out that the movements of the heavens are polyphonic. It's not a static chord. The harmony of the spheres is not just a chord. Because they're moving in ellipses, they're changing their speed as they move, and we live in a kind of polyphonic heavenly world. It's also, as we know from evolutionary cosmology, an evolutionary world. So the will of God on earth as in heaven, at least on a modern understanding, is evolutionary. However, it's also very clear, in the light of our discussions this morning, that it's not about making products and then dumping them. The heavens all work on a recycling economy. When stars break down, their stardust turns into planets, and part of that stardust turns into us. There's a recycling throughout the whole of the universe, and it does give us a model of how things can work on Earth, which is different from the older understanding. And then give us this day our daily bread. Presumably, if this prayer is going to go on working, then agriculture has to be sustainable. And I think that it's important to rethink this, which is the most familiar of all prayers throughout the Christian and post-Christian world that we live in. Because this is a prayer prayed by millions of people every day. And many people pray it very sincerely. But I think reinterpreting the way we pray and what we're praying for can have quite a lot of relevance to sustainable food and agriculture. I'd like to end just by mentioning one final spiritual practice in which I'm very interested and in which two of Britain's leading proponents are here today, namely pilgrimage. Because pilgrimage, as Will likes pointing out, the peregrine, the word for pilgrimage was the peregrine. There's someone who goes through the fields. The pilgrim is someone moving through the fields. And on pilgrimage on foot, we travel through the landscape, through the countryside, and relate to the land, connecting holy places with the fields and the land that we move through. And pilgrimage is probably the best way in which we can actually embody a relationship to the land, an appreciation of it, and a connection to our own spiritual journey in accordance with the traditions in which we're all rooted, the traditions of our land and the holy places of our land, which include sacred wells and springs and river sources and cathedrals and churches and ancient trees. And luckily, the British Pilgrimage Trust is doing a lot to reawaken this spirit of pilgrimage, which our ancestors took part in and indeed took for granted. Well, that's enough for me, and I want to hand over now to Marc Andrus. He's going to say a little about these themes, and then we're going to discuss them together. Good.
So interesting things happened around early 60s, didn't they? It was an interesting time in the world. And one of the things that happened is that there was a reoccurrence of something that had become very attenuated over the last 300 years before that, and that is there was a reoccurrence of people saying how important it is that the world is integral and interconnected. This was remarkable at the time. Some of those people were Martin Luther King, who said in 1963 that the main thing he wanted to say is that all of life is interconnected. And quoting St. Paul, he said that if one part of the world suffers, what? All suffers. So this is becoming more commonplace. The Prince went over it numbers of times this morning. We all accept that idea. It came as a surprise in a backdrop of a world that had lost that sense of integrity and interconnection. One of those folks that was popping this idea forward again is James Lovelock with his book Gaia, which was only published a decade later in the early 70s. But he had the idea in 1964, a year after King wrote his letter from Birmingham jail, which is where he said this about interconnection. And in his book, which is a tremendously important book, he has this quotation. And it's not very long, and I'll read it out loud if you can't see it very well. As society became more urbanized, the proportion of information flow from the biosphere to the pool of knowledge which constitutes the wisdom of the city decreased. Soon, city wisdom became almost entirely centered on the problems of human relationships, in contrast to the wisdom of any natural tribal group, where relationships with the rest of the animate and inanimate world are still given due place. I know that he misspelled centered, but you know, Um, so this is a really interesting idea in this conversation about science and spirituality. There is an information flow, Lovelock is saying, from the world, the whole world, into the human community that has made itself into cities. This starts in the Bible narrative with the first murderer. Cain is the first person to build a city. The first thing he does after God confronts him with with the murder of his brother is to go and build a city. And from there, this is the Bible's casting a question, a dubious question about what is urban existence. And from there, Lovelock says that we more and more became centered on what are we about? What in the city we're interested in what we're doing, each other, and not this information that is coming in from the world and informing us. So we could change that in very practical, easy ways, in ways that Rupert was talking about, spiritual practices. But how many of you connect to CSAs or to local farming communities that bring you food or from which you purchase food? Let me see a show of hands. Many, many of you. So those often show up on your porch, or you may go to a farmer's market, and that's a more pleasant kind of exchange. And maybe, some of you, I'd be interested to know, have a way that there's a forum for conversation with the farmers, where that is not just dropped off as a commodity, a wonderful commodity, beautifully grown, lovingly produced in ways that are helpful, but that you actually got the information that the farmer has in a way that I do not have about the weather, the soil, the interconnections of the ecosystem. How many of you have that conversation with the people producing that food? And it doesn't count if you're the producer yourself. But far fewer, right? So that's interesting. So we could foster that. We could foster that. When Sheila and I moved to Virginia for her PhD and my master's, I started work in a dairy that was owned by the university. So the farmers who were farming, and I became a farmer for that time, we did not own our own farm. We lived in other places. Sheila and I lived in the town, but the farmers all gathered. And we worked together during the day and then went home. And it was remarkable to me that they had conversations about the weather patterns, unlike the weather conversations we have, which is, to cover awkwardness and so on. They talked about the weather with great observation about, I noticed, Frank, that the storm started over your place last night. And then it moved. They're deeply observant of this. This kind of information, and much richer information, is available to urbanites like myself and Sheila if we would invite these conversations. So that's a simple thing. And there are many other ways we could do this. But the reference to seeing the Earth from space that Nick, in his wonderful beginning, gave to us, quite an important idea. But in it, there's been buried a mistake. And that mistake is that we have equated the world with the earth. And the world is not the earth, or the earth is within the world, not only within the sky, but the sky is containing the world. The world is a translation of a Greek word, cosmos. That is where we get the word world. And so the world contains more, contains the earth and more. Ancient models of the world look somewhat like this. This is an ancient model of the world. So the world was the earth, and we would see it from the earth, but we would then see planets, and planets means wanderers, as you know, because they didn't follow the more predictable patterns of the stars, and it contained the stars. All of these were living, animate beings who were deeply interconnected with each other, and that was the world. The world looks very different to us now, and both Rupert and Nicolas said something about the vastness of this. So that's a beautiful thing. that's our closer home. And you've seen this. It's so stunningly beautiful. Sorry. But you're familiar with it, you know. We're located on one of the arms, far out on one of the arms of the Milky Way. But we've also taken on, there's a cultural lag. As we learn more and more about the cosmos, about the world, we take on the ideas of scientists, and they become true for us slowly. But we don't keep up. We don't update. We don't update our software for what science is having. So really, most of us are dealing with an early 20th century or late 19th century view of the world. And as Rick Tarnas has said, one of my teachers, it's dominated by the idea of the machine. It's an idea that the universe, everything, acts kind of like a machine. So what happens to machines? They break down. They don't maintain themselves. So this idea that the whole universe is moving towards entropy, to a kind of dead state. Also, it's not alive. It's not conscious. It's not integral. These are things that we have taken on with the vastness of it and the beauty of it. But if there's life, and people keep saying it like that, it's maybe a little bit somewhere out there, but between us, life, and that is nothingness, cold and not connected and dead. This is not true. We have so much more current science that has not been incorporated in our idea of what the world is. What is some of that? Well, the idea of entanglement, the idea of consciousness in the whole universe. Perhaps you would say the idea of love in the whole universe. There is quite a lot that would, and sacrifice. These ideas are ideas that I live with all the time in religious ideas. They are also ideas scientists are using to talk about how the universe works. So if we take this idea of a vast world that is so much more than that antique idea of the world and start to think about dark matter, entanglement, consciousness, and love, we have a reanimated world that is vastly larger, a place where God can be seen, and that's the last piece, is that we've also X'd God out. It's just too hard to maintain the idea of a God that went in that old world. You see, Marcus Borg made this point in his beautiful book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. He was raised as a Lutheran. Many of you know the book, I'm sure. And he said that when he got into university, he ceased believing. Even though he was a doctoral student then in New Testament, he ceased believing in Christ or in God or in the Trinity because fundamentally the idea of Jesus that he had been taught as a child was no longer adequate to the problems he faced in his life. It's the same idea I'm talking about the world. It wasn't updated to accommodate an adult who struggles in his life. So it is with the idea of God in the universe. So all of this is a great image. This beautiful God as a geometer making the world. I put this here to end this, to say that the world, the information that Lovelock was talking about coming from the biosphere, he very clearly understood the biosphere to be only the earth. But the world, as I said, contains the earth, and the world is reanimated. We are seeing the world, the whole world, as living. And so the God of that world is also something that you and I might stand in front of as a question and say, how can we encounter and receive information from, not just speak to? I find that in Christian circles in which I move, prayer is mostly speaking to God. And when we're finished, we hang up the phone. If you had a friend, I usually ask confirmands, 14-year-olds, if you have a friend who calls you every night at 6 o'clock, or let's say 9:30 bedtime, and kind of rants at you. You know, they did this to me today, and I'm also worried about my grandmother and the cat, and I've got a big test tomorrow, and all this goes on, and then abruptly they say goodnight and they hang up. And the sixth day they do that, how would you respond? What would you do on the sixth day when you get your friend's call like that? What would you do? What? Stop answering the phone, hang up, call medical authorities. Yeah, but this is how we pray. And so this is what Lovelock is talking about, the information coming into the city. And so this is coming from the farms. It's coming from the planets. It's coming from the vast reaches of space, from the universe. And it's coming from God. And the question is, how can we have spiritual practices that will allow us to receive the information that this loving world, the whole loving world, animated by God, is always willing to give us?
There's a kind of harmony between heaven and earth, but it's not the kind of harmony that was imagined at the time of Plato, where there was a kind of rather static mathematical order. It's now an evolving harmony. It started with the polyphony of Kepler, but now with a universe that contains supernovas and so on, it's not just smooth progression. There are cataclysmic events in the universe as well. And this doesn't necessarily bode well for if we just want kind of smooth, sustainable development with no hiccups, because the universe is not like that. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to see this connection of heaven and earth, then it's one where a study of what really happens in the heaven could inform more about what's happening on earth.
Oh, I love that.
Yes.
Well, yeah, so the idea of how we might actualize that, this idea of the heaven. So Jesus, I've been thinking about your theme, and Nick really brought it alive so much too. Jesus walked around saying his consistent message, and he told his disciples to proclaim the same thing, was that the kingdom of heaven has come near. And he said the kingdom of heaven, it's usually translated as within you, but as you pointed out, I mean, that's really reductionist. He actually said the kingdom of heaven is among you. So this idea of the sky, the heavens, God is in the sky, and the word Uranos comes from Uranus, the god. The sky was a god.
Yes.
For the Greeks, and yet at the same time it permeates everything. You know, it's not just that it contains it, but it's replicated in totality in the individual, in the community, and in the world. And so as we encounter with mindfulness, using that term, every particle of our daily life, we have the capacity to awaken to the kingdom of heaven, I think. I mean, I think it's worth asking, how do you take what Jesus was saying when he says the kingdom of heaven has come near? My old teacher of New Testament, Reginald Fuller, who was English, used to say that this was the prime statement of Jesus when he says, if I, by the finger of God, cast out demons, then the kingdom of heaven has come among you. So what does he mean by that?
I know I spend a lot of time wondering about it, because since I take the heaven to be the sky and not just some kind of metaphorical idealized space,
right.
Then what can it mean? And clearly it means something to do with a better state than we're in. It suggests an evolutionary process. The coming of the kingdom of heaven suggests it hasn't already come. In other words, we're moving towards something.
It's come near.
It's coming near.
It's like an asymptote. So it's not quite here yet.
And the interesting thing about the whole Judeo-Christian model of history is that it's going somewhere. It's moving towards an end or a goal. Whereas in the Hindu and the Greek views of history, most classical civilizations, history is a cycle. It goes in cycles. Civilizations rise, they fall, empires increase, decrease, the wheel of fortune turns, lives come and go in cycles of reincarnation. But the Judeo-Christian model is one that has the idea of things moving somewhere. And in its secularized form, it gives us progress. I mean, the concept of progress is a secularization of this model. Mm-hmm. And so, in a sense, the secular version of the kingdom of heaven is progress through science and technology so that diseases can be eliminated, no longer through casting out demons, but through wonder drugs and keyhole surgery. This is part of the realization of the kingdom of heaven. We all approve of it because that's one way of doing it. Another way is overcoming injustice and persecution, and to some extent the human rights movement, which I think is a derivative of Christianity. It's a secular derivative, has done something to remove injustice and persecution. So there's many ways in which Western civilization, perhaps even more in its secularized form than in its Christian form, has been moving towards some kind of goal.
Right.
But that goal in its purely secular form is, it turns out to be one of just increasing consumption, ever rising incomes, greater productivity. And clearly that's not a suitable goal for the kingdom of heaven.
Right. So the idea of the progress and the Judeo-Christian idea moving from point A to point Omega, I think it's been overworked by folks in my field. And, you know, if we take the Bible as was put together, right? I mean, each piece of it was produced as something separate. I mean, there were chunks that were connected to each other, like Luke, Acts, and 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. But then somebody really thought about what is the sweep of this story, and they put it together in a way that it has an overarching structure. So it begins in a garden, right? This is where the story begins, with farmers. And there's some features, and you actually mentioned it partly about Plato this morning. There's some features of this garden, and I mean, if this is our common heritage, what's in that garden? What features of it can you name? I mean, anyone?
Beautiful, delicious, desirable.
Yeah, but like what's, fruit, all right. And the fruit grows on trees. And there are how many? Yeah, there are at least 2.
Yes.
And they're in the middle. And one of them we abrogated to ourselves, and one is forbidden to us. And the one that's forbidden is which one? Knowledge is the one we took. The good and evil is the one we ate of. Life is the one. So at the end of the whole Bible, in this book that very few Episcopalians ever read, the book of Revelation, and I don't know why we don't. It's really lurid and fantastic, and maybe that's why. In that book, we return to the garden, the tree of life, which is there, its leaves for the healing of the nations, a beautiful idea, is there at the end of time, but there's a new element. And it's the city, this whole city that Cain founded, the New Jerusalem, comes down like a spaceship into the garden. So it actually doesn't describe a circle, it describes a spiral. So there's been a change from where we began in the garden through a degradation with the city and to a redemption and transformation of a city that is now located in the garden, where presumably this information flows beautifully, perfectly between God, all of nature, and humanity. Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing, yes. I mean, one aspect is it does suggest an original form of permaculture. And I'm surprised the permaculture people haven't sort of made more of the Garden of Eden. The other thing is that one of the things about the city of God in the book of Revelation is it's permanently light. So presumably there's no darkness there. So presumably photosynthesis is going on so strongly the question of sustainability hardly arises.
I love you so much. You're so amazing. We'll see. too much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think. Well, first of all, I think when people meditate, it's a form of prayer which is not about asking for things. I meditate every morning and I pray every evening, so I have experience of both these forms. And um, I don't see prayer as primarily just sort of emailing off requests to the celestial Amazon, and if one's really good, you get prime deliveries. And so I don't see it like that. I see it as really an opening to what kinds of things might happen. I mean, I do make requests in my prayers, but I don't necessarily expect an answer right then. When I meditate, where I'm trying not to put forward requests or intercessions or anything, but rather to allow the mind to be free through the use of a mantra. I find, as most people who meditate do, there's a constant inrush of thoughts and ideas, but some of them are answers to prayer, and some of them come as inspirations for things I want to say or do or or chapters in I'm writing a book, and suddenly a whole idea for a chapter appears in my meditation, and part of my prayer is prayer for inspiration and guidance. So I find that meditation, although that's not its primary purpose, can serve much more as the kind of answering, listening, and prayer more as so they're somewhat separate in my own life. I think also one of the things that all of us can pray for is guidance and inspiration. Mm-hmm. And if we pray for guidance and inspiration, then I feel that we often get it more than if we don't pray for it, or are more open to it when it arises. And it can arise in many ways, through people we meet, through conversations we have, through things we see on the news, through just chances in our schedules where things happen that we didn't expect to happen in our lives. So I see the interactive process of prayer as happening in quite a few different ways. I mean, the ultimate Christian festival of inspiration is Pentecost, the Feast of the Holy Spirit. Theresa May is a practicing Christian, and presumably, like most other people on Pentecost, was praying for divine inspiration. She scheduled the election for the Thursday after Pentecost, and the Spirit is very unexpected. It does unexpected things, and no one expected what would happen in that election. And it's put us in a position where all the old certainties are no longer certain, and the space is open. And I see that as an answer.
Don't go too far. Don't go too far with that, because Sheila and I were in Marrakesh on the day of the American election, and that didn't go so well for us. But possibilities are surprising.
It creates new openings.
Yeah, it does. I hope so.
Yeah.
So I think Rupert took us to the Lord's Prayer, and there are two ways that Jesus speaks about that prayer in Luke and in Matthew. And in one, he says, pray in this way, like as a model. And in another, he says, pray this prayer. And I think, probably the more original, there's reasons I think this, but is pray it as a model. And there was a great English theologian and novelist, Charles Williams, who was part of that circle with J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield, the Inklings. And he wrote these beautiful novels that were kind of Christian fantasies set in England in that time period in the 1950s and 40s. And in one of them, he describes prayer for one of his major characters, who's there's always a very advanced person, usually a woman, in these books that is the model for what he thinks a spiritually mature, open person to God is like. And he describes her prayer. And so it's like this beautiful view of what Charles Williams thinks prayer would be like. And it really is a way of taking the part, thy will be done, in the Lord's Prayer and making it a spiritual practice. So what she would do is simply hold in her mind, her heart, the image of the person for whom she was concerned. And she didn't say to God, I would like you to do this or the other. She would simply hold that person to God and trust God to do what was needed for that person. So I would say that. is one thing. The other piece is give us this day our daily bread. That's a very contested part of to understand what the Greek means. It's epiousion, the daily bread, and it means literally, give me today the daily ration for tomorrow, so that I might have enough. I think it's for the work of justice. I think this is what he's praying, that I would be given just enough that I can do the work that I have to do. Annie Lamott, the American author, was going through the worst time of her alcohol addiction and depression, and a Presbyterian minister said that she only prayed for enough light to see where to put the next step. And that's similar to the daily bread idea. So those are two things about prayer. Your question about how do you know? So two things: you don't. I mean, you can't really, but I trust this loving God. I mean, that's the first thing. So I think that's hard in today's world. Trustworthiness is difficult. I watched 2 films on the flight here from New York, and they were both these. Well, one was a kind of a, well, I won't tell you, but they all have to do with betrayal and trust. That was the theme through the whole thing, and people relate to this because they find in this world that there's a lot of untrustworthiness. This God who is Brian Swimme says that the universe, starting from the great flaring forth, what when I was a kid was called the Big Bang, is shot through, I quote this all the time, is shot through with love and with libido. Love and desire, love and eros. And then he says, if you ask me how I know that, it is because I am too. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. So can you trust yourself, and can you trust this cosmos suffused by God? So that's one thing. The other thing is that it is best if we pray in community. I mean, by ourselves, but in community. And I think this is lacking for so many of us today, an actual spiritual community, a sangha in Buddhist terms, or a church in Christian terms, a parish, a community. And that's where we test out our spiritual understandings. If something has come to us in the ordination process in the Episcopal Church, in the Anglican Church, if a person comes to me as the bishop and says, God has called me to be a priest in the church, I receive that. I mean, I think that's really an important statement. But that is the mere beginning of the process. And it's not a bureaucratic process. It's a community process where we believe that the Holy Spirit is in the wholeness of the community, and that we need representatives of the whole community to help test the truthfulness of that call, whether they really heard God or something else. So I think the community is an important way to test the truthfulness of an intuition that we've received in prayer. A young person, Sheila and I know, did his undergraduate thesis on the Iliad, and he pointed out that the heart was the only organ in all the gore of the battle scenes that didn't stay in the body. It would go flying out. And this is actually how the heart is. It's not, it is a physical organ and it is a metaphysical organ at the same time. And this is true in the Bible as well. Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart is as well. And so you are. So our hearts are located in different places. They're not, they're not trapped inside us. As Rupert said, it's not, the mind is not trapped inside the brain, nor is the heart trapped inside the beating element here. It beats, but it depends on where our treasure is, which is important.
I mean, both of us are Christians, and normally my experience is that whenever one has a discussion about spirituality in modern Britain, the one thing that is never mentioned is Christianity. I'm used to the ABC approach, anything but Christian. Buddhism's okay, shamanism, Native American drumming. I'm in favor of all those things. But I do think it's important in our culture to connect with our heritage, just as if you go on a pilgrimage through our land, many of the ancient sacred sites are Christian. If we're dealing with prayers and the relation of heaven and earth and the harmonious relation of heaven and earth, unless we come to terms with the Christian tradition and those Christian prayers, then we've just tried to airbrush out the whole of our cultural heritage, and we're adrift. I do think it's very important, if one's Christian or not, to come to terms with the Christian tradition.
As Rupert said, we are both Christians, and I spend actually a great deal of time, if you knew my work, with Buddhists, particularly, a great deal of time, maybe more than my community's really comfortable with, but it really wouldn't be right for me to speak from that perspective. So that's the best I can do. And if it's disappointing, as you say, you have minds, and I'm very open, as I know Rupert is, to hearing, well, what is this for you? In other words, I'm not saying, nor is Rupert, that this is what you should subscribe to, and this is definitely not creedal. But if you talk about meditation and prayer from the base that we know, I think I view it as an opening myself for you to say, what is it for you? And I think there's space for that.
You see, I'm what you probably don't know about Marc is that his cathedral is a great center of yoga in San Francisco. It's not a tub thumping, they have the whole cathedral full of people doing yoga. And I think it's a wonderful integration. Another way of integrating them, as Guy said, is through chanting. And every tradition has chanting. Every tradition has the use of the voice.
As you eat anything, he invites people to understand the entire universe is present in each bite that you take. And I practice that. So we had Sheila bought 2 spinach, cheese, and mushroom crepes that we had on the flight. And with each bite, I stopped, and you can taste each piece of it. If you take your time, you can taste the spinach, you can taste the cheese, you can taste the crepe, the bread, and the mushrooms. And I imagined, and imagination is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. I imagined the chain of production that brought that taste to me. And it finally involves the stars, the earth itself, but all the working people who have farmed it. All of that was present to me in a meditation with each bite through the entire, I ate the whole crepe. And it was an eating meditation in Thich Nhat Hanh's Buddhist way. I think it's entirely Christian as well, because when St. Paul says, if you eat the bread and drink the wine without discerning the body, and by that he did not mean in the bread, he meant the community. If you can't see the community that you're connected to, then you eat and drink to your own destruction.
Whereas it is holy, holy is the ground. Forest, mountain, river, listen to my sound. Great spirits circling all around me. Where I sit is holy, holy is the ground. Forest, mountain, river, listen to my sound. Great spirits circling all around me. Where I sit is holy, holy is the ground. Forest, mountain, river, listen to my sound. Great spirits circling all around me. Where I sit is holy, holy is the ground. Forest, mountain, river, listen to my sound. Great Spirit circling all around me. Where I sit is holy. Where I sit is holy. Where I sit is holy. Holy is the ground. Holy is the ground. Holy is the ground. Forest, mountain, river, listen to my sound. Great Spirit circling all